You already knew which shelf she kept the cornmeal on, and you knew not to ask what was in the gravy. That knowledge lived in the hands, not on a card. Here are 30 forgotten poor man breakfasts from the 1960s that vanished with the women who made them. Fried cornmeal mush was the breakfast that stretched a nearly empty pantry into something worth getting up for. You made it the night before. Cornmeal stirred into boiling salted water until thick enough to hold a wooden spoon upright, then poured into a loaf pan and left to set overnight. By morning, it had firmed into something you could slice. You cut it into half-inch slabs and laid them in a skillet of hot butter or lard, listening for the sizzle that told you the fat was right. The edges crisped while the centers stayed tender, almost custardy, with a deep corn sweetness that met the butter at the crust. You drizzled sorghum or whatever thin excuse for maple syrup the family had. Midwestern farm families had made it this way since the 1800s, and Appalachian households carried the same tradition well into the 1960s. The technique identical, only the pan changing from iron to aluminum. Nobody called it polenta. Nobody knew to. It went quiet when boxed cereals got cheap enough to replace it, and the person who made it never once thought to write it down. Before there was sausage in the gravy, there was tomato. Tomato gravy was the late summer answer to an overloaded garden and an understocked pantry, bacon drippings from the can, a roux of flour browned dark enough to smell nutty, and tomatoes too soft to do anything else with. You peeled them with your fingers over the skillet, let the juice hiss into the hot fat, and stirred until it thickened into something tangy and rust red that had no business tasting as good as it did. Appalachian food authority Ronnie Lundy documented tomato gravy as a distinct regional tradition in her cookbook Victuals, tracing it through the mountains of Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee, where it appeared over biscuits, cornbread, and grits. It was the gravy you made when there was no sausage, no cream, nothing but a pan and tomatoes that wouldn't last another day. You knew who in the family made it right, and you knew the others didn't get the roux dark enough. The women who made it never measured a single thing. Cold cornbread in buttermilk was not a recipe. It was a habit so old in the rural South that children reached for a glass before they were fully awake. You crumbled in yesterday's cornbread, the dense, unsweetened kind baked in a cast-iron skillet, and the cold buttermilk soaked into every crevice until it softened into something between cereal and porridge, tangy and grainy and thick with the smell of soured cream. Some families ate it with a spoon. Some drank it straight from the glass. Wikipedia's entry on cornbread documents this practice. Cornbread crumbled into cold milk or clabber, similar to cold cereal. But no entry captures why it always tasted better from her glass than from yours. The tradition survived in households where buttermilk still came from a farm and cornbread was made daily. It slipped away when commercial buttermilk changed and skillet cornbread gave way to the boxed kind, and the taste of a cold glass on a hot July morning stopped being the thing that meant home. She called it toad in a hole, and you never heard that name anywhere else. You cut a circle from the center of a slice of bread with the rim of a glass, or a biscuit cutter if she had one, your thumb pressing down if she didn't, then laid the bread flat in a buttered pan, cracked an egg directly into the hole, and waited. The bread fried golden while the yolk cooked through, the whole thing coming out in one piece if you got the heat right. The trick was temperature. Too low and the bread went pale and greasy, too high and the egg set before the toast colored. And the only way to learn was to stand next to her and watch. Depression-era cookbooks listed it under names like Egg in a Frame and One-Eyed Sam, but in this kitchen it had whatever name the woman who made it first had given it. It cost 1 egg and 1 slice of bread. In those 1960s kitchens, that was not nothing. Today, it's $12 on a brunch menu, which would have made her laugh. Before the skillet was hot, you already knew what breakfast was going to be, because there was a bowl of cold mashed potatoes in the icebox from last night's supper, and nothing in that kitchen went to waste. Leftover mashed potato cakes were the thriftiest alchemy the working kitchen ever managed. You packed yesterday's soft and plain into flat rounds with your palms, pressed them into a skillet of hot bacon grease, and waited. The outside sealed into a crust that crackled under a fork while the inside stayed creamy and dense. Appalachian cooks in central Kentucky and Tennessee used this technique specifically because mountain communities substituted potatoes for rice. The land wouldn't grow rice, making the leftover potato cake a staple that appeared at breakfast, dinner, and supper depending on what else was available. You measured nothing. You just knew when the patty felt right in your hand. And if you had to ask, you weren't ready to make them. Chocolate gravy sounds like something a child invented, which is almost exactly what it was. Except the mothers and grandmothers of the Ozarks and Southern Appalachians invented it, and they were feeding the whole family. You melted butter in a skillet, stirred in flour until it cooked, added cocoa powder, sugar, and whole milk, and kept stirring until it thickened into something dark and glossy over cathead biscuits. The dish, also called cocoa gravy, soppan chocolate, or chocolate mush, was documented across communities from North Carolina and West Virginia through the Arkansas Ozarks and into northeast Mississippi. Sunday morning food, the reward for getting through the week. The smell of cocoa hitting a hot roux at 6 in the morning is a smell that does not leave you. The women who made it never used a recipe. They poured until the color looked right, tasted until the sweet matched the bitter, and that knowledge left the kitchen when they did. Red-eye gravy needed only 2 things: country ham and black coffee, and if you had to ask why, you weren't from the South. You fried a thick slice of salt-cured ham in a dry cast-iron pan until the fat rendered and the meat browned with a dark caramelized crust on both sides. Then you poured hot black coffee directly into the hot pan, scraped up everything stuck to the bottom, and the whole thing bubbled into a thin, dark, savory liquid you spooned over biscuits or grits. The name came from the ring of fat that floated to the surface and looked in the right light like a bloodshot eye. And knowing that detail separated people who grew up in these kitchens from people who only read about them. Andrew Jackson was reportedly a devoted eater, and the dish appears in cookbooks as far back as the early 1800s. By the 1960s, it had retreated to rural households and old-line Southern diners where nobody had thought to take it off the menu. It faded the same way country ham faded. Cracklin cornbread required a hog killing, or at least access to someone who'd just had one. Cracklings, the crisp, brittle pieces of pork skin left behind after you rendered the lard, smelling of wood smoke and hot fat, went straight into the cornbread batter in Appalachian and Deep South kitchens before it hit the pan. You mixed coarse ground cornmeal with buttermilk, a cracked egg if you had one, salt, and a handful of broken cracklings, then poured it into a skillet so hot the batter sealed the moment it landed. The crackling pieces distributed through the bread as it baked, their fat seeping into the crumb and making it tender in a way plain cornbread never matched. Wikipedia documents this specifically as a Southern dish, pork cracklings baked into skillet cornbread. What no entry says is that you could always tell who'd gotten to the cracklings first, and the fragments at the bottom of the bowl before the batter went in were considered fair game. The dripping pan sat on the back of the stove all week, and on Monday morning it was breakfast. Bread drippings, the solidified fat and juices from Sunday's roast, were spread cold on toast with a pinch of salt, exactly the way butter would have been used if butter had been available. In working-class households across the rural South and Midwest in the 1960s, the dripping jar was as standard as the salt shaker, and you knew at a glance what had been cooked that week by the color of what was in it: pale yellow from chicken, gray-white from beef, amber-dark from pork. The tradition traced to British and German immigrant kitchens where bread and drippings had been a laborer's staple for centuries, and it survived long after it vanished from cookbooks. Heritage food researcher Adele Nozadar documented this as a centuries-old British working-class practice still recalled by people in their 70s. The can went away when the refrigerator came, and what went with it was the specific economy of never letting anything go. Salt pork and cornmeal gravy was the winter answer, older than anyone who made it could remember. You fried slices of salt-cured pork until the fat rendered out, removed the meat, and stirred cornmeal directly into the hot drippings, cooking it until it turned pale gold and smelled of toasted corn. Then came the milk, poured slowly while you scraped the pan, and the whole thing thickened into a gravy gritty and substantial in a way flour gravy never was. Food historians trace this cornmeal thickened version to the original lumber camp kitchens of southern Appalachia in the 1800s. The gritty texture led workers to joke the cook had used sawdust, and the name sawmill gravy stuck. By the 1960s, the flour and sausage version had largely replaced it, surviving only in households where women had learned it from women who'd learned it from the camps. The last of them are gone now. Scrapple was Pennsylvania Dutch country's answer to the entire hog. You took the scraps, head meat, organs, trimmings that would otherwise be discarded, simmered them in broth until tender, then combined that meat with cornmeal, flour, and spices, and poured the mixture into a loaf pan to chill solid overnight. In the morning, you sliced it thin, a quarter-inch at most, and fried each piece in a dry pan until the outside formed a crust that crackled when you pressed it with a fork. The loaf came from German immigrant traditions carried to Pennsylvania in the 17th century, where it was called panhas. The takeout has documented scrapple as surviving today only in Pennsylvania Dutch country and around Philadelphia, nearly impossible to find elsewhere. An entire regional breakfast tradition that fed working families for 3 centuries, quietly returned to the place it came from, and nobody outside that place noticed it leave. There was no recipe for kush. It wasn't that kind of thing. You crumbled a leftover biscuit into the bottom of a cup, poured in your morning coffee, strong, dark, often cut with chicory because it stretched further, added a spoon of sorghum molasses, and ate it with a spoon before the bread dissolved. In the Smoky Mountain living account of one Appalachian family's traditions, a father recalled eating this his whole life, calling it his favorite dessert even when food was plentiful, savoring it the way someone who'd gone without did not waste small pleasures. The bitterness of the chicory, the sweetness of the sorghum, the softening biscuit still firm enough to push against a spoon. You either knew what it was or you didn't, and the people who knew it were the ones in those kitchens before sunrise, watching the fire get started. There is no commercial version of kush. It lived entirely in memory, and memory has its limits. The smell hit you before you got to the kitchen. Not the warm sweetness of oats cooking in milk, but something thicker, saltier, more like a skillet than a pot. Oatmeal with bacon grease was what happened when the milk was out and the sugar was low and there were 6 people to feed before sunrise. You cooked the rolled oats in plain water, no dairy, no sweetener, and when the pot came off the stove, you dropped a spoonful of saved bacon fat into the bowl and sprinkled coarse salt over the top. The fat melted in rings across the surface. In mill towns across Tennessee, West Virginia, and the Ohio Valley in the 1960s, this was the standard weekday breakfast for households where the husband left for a 6 a.m. shift and the family ate whatever was fastest and cheapest. The grease gave the oats a savory depth that plain water never managed, and the salt sharpened every bite. Children who grew up eating it this way never quite trusted the sweet version. It tasted like something was missing. Fried grits cakes were what happened after Tuesday. You made a pot of plain grits on Monday, coarse ground white hominy simmered in salted water until thick, poured the leftovers into a greased pan, and by morning they had set solid. You sliced them, fried each piece in lard or a dry skillet until the outside crisped into a golden shell while the inside stayed soft and creamy. A different breakfast entirely from the one it started as. South Carolina Low Country cooks had been making fried grits cakes since at least the 1850s, the tradition spreading inland through the Carolinas and Georgia as a standard use of yesterday's pot. You ate them with eggs, cane syrup, or just salt. The woman who made them knew, without measuring exactly how thick to pour the pan, so the cakes came out even. When she stopped cooking, nobody thought to ask how she knew. If cracklin' cornbread was the food of strength, milk toast was the food of giving in. You made it when someone was sick, or very young or very old. You toasted white bread, buttered it while hot, tore it into pieces in a bowl, and poured warm sweetened milk over the top until it softened into something that required no effort to eat. In the 1960s, it was still the standard invalid food in rural households, the thing you brought upstairs on a tray. The 1924 Wheat Council campaign had promoted warm milk toast specifically as a school child's breakfast, calling it one of the best things you could give a child in the morning. By the 60s, its reputation as sick food was complete, and children ate it without complaint only because being sick already felt bad enough. The women who made it are gone. The sick days in those specific rooms are gone. And the particular quiet of a tray being carried upstairs on a cold morning, that is gone too. Nobody called it coffee soup with any affection. It was what it was: stale bread broken into a deep bowl, covered with weak coffee and warm milk, sweetened with whatever sugar the family had, eaten with a spoon before it turned to paste. In rural Appalachian and Amish communities, the dish had survived from Depression-era kitchens into the 1960s almost unchanged. A breakfast born when coffee and bread were the two things a household reliably had. Food Republic has documented coffee soup as persisting today in Amish communities as a minimalist morning meal with roots in both German-American and Appalachian frugality. Children ate it because the alternative was going to school hungry. Some of them grew up and forgot they'd ever eaten it, until a particular smell caught them somewhere, coffee and bread in the same breath, and something from before memory surfaced. That is what coffee soup left behind. Not a recipe, not a reputation, just a smell that knows exactly where to find you. Water gravy was what came before everything else. Before sausage made it into the skillet, before milk made it into white gravy, before the post-war years brought enough prosperity to have a choice, there was water. You rendered bacon fat or pork drippings, stirred flour into the hot fat and cooked it dark enough to lose the raw smell, then poured water instead of milk and scraped the pan while it thickened. Salt, pepper, and that was it. Southern food writers Sarah Rohan and John T. Edge documented this in the Southern Foodways Alliance Community Cookbook. The Southern tradition of gravy was born of privation, and when folks are poor, folks make gravy. Water gravy was the proof. It had no business being edible, and it was, not in spite of what it lacked, but because of what the hands that made it understood about heat and patience and a hot pan. The women who made it would not have called it resourcefulness. They would have called it Tuesday. Fried Fatback had opinions, and so did everyone at the table about whose was done right. You sliced the salt-cured slab of pure pork fat, no lean, just white fat with a rind that could stop a fork, into strips and laid them in a cold cast-iron pan you brought up to heat slowly so the fat could render before the outside burned. The rind had to get brittle. If it bent, it wasn't done. You ate it with cornbread and weak coffee. The fat that rendered out stayed in the pan for the next thing, the gravy, the cornbread, the fried potatoes, because nothing from a fatback pan went to waste. In Appalachian households through the 1960s, fatback was still the primary cooking fat and breakfast meat for families who raised hogs, bought pork in bulk at butchering season, and salted it in crocks for winter. The argument was always about the rind. Some families fried it soft, others fried it hard enough to snap. That argument outlasted the people who had it. She started them the night before, always the night before. Dried apple slices or prunes were put in a covered pot with water and a stick of cinnamon and left on the back of the wood stove overnight, where the residual heat did the slow work. By morning, the fruit had plumped and the liquid reduced into a dark, fragrant syrup that smelled of warm spice and concentrated sweetness. Better than the fresh version, the way things that have been through something tend to be. In households without refrigeration into the early 1960s, dried fruit compote was the only fruit at breakfast through winter in rural mountain regions. Appalachian families dried apples in late August by slicing them thin and hanging the rings from barn rafters, documented in regional food histories as essential winter provisioning before reliable cold storage. The wood stoves are gone. The rafters with their apple rings are gone. And the woman who knew how much water to add is gone too. And nobody thought to ask before she left. But if any of those breakfasts still had a fight left in them, it was liver mush, and nobody who grew up in Cleveland County, North Carolina, would hear a word against it. Pork liver ground fine and combined with cornmeal, sage, and black pepper, packed into a loaf to chill until sliceable, then fried until the outside crisped into a dark, savory shell while the inside stayed dense and smooth. It tasted of iron and spice and something ancient that people found repulsive on description and couldn't stop eating on contact. Born in the 1930s when liver was one of the cheapest cuts available, it survived into the 1960s as a staple across the Carolina Piedmont. Shelby, North Carolina, has held an annual Liver Mush Festival since 1987, the Mush, Mud, and Music Festival, celebrating the tradition with full civic pride. Outside a narrow swath of Western Carolina, nobody knows it exists. Inside it, nobody needs to be told. Fried green tomatoes at breakfast predated the movie by 50 years, and in the kitchens where they were made, nobody thought of them as a cultural symbol. They were what you did with September tomatoes that hadn't ripened before the first cold came. You sliced them thick, green all the way through, firm as an apple, with a tartness that mellowed in the pan, dredged them in seasoned cornmeal, and fried them in bacon drippings until the coating crisped gold and the tomato just yielded to a fork. The cornmeal crackled between your teeth before the tart heat of the tomato came through. The crunch, and then the soft, and then the sour, a sequence that belonged to a specific season in a specific kind of yard. By the 1980s, the green tomato had become a Southern cliché. In the 1960s, it was just breakfast, and the garden was just a garden. Souse appeared after the hog killing, usually in November, and it appeared on the breakfast table for about 2 weeks before anyone had reason to complain. Head cheese, boiled pork head meat, tongue, and snout, pulled from the bone, packed with vinegar, spices, and gelatin-rich broth to set overnight, was sliced thin and laid on toast or eaten cold with a fork. The German and Scotch-Irish immigrants who settled Appalachia brought souse-making traditions from Europe, where similar preparations went by names like sulza and potted head, and the technique merged with the American practice of using every part of the hog at season's end. In the 1960s, rural households that still raised and slaughtered their own pigs made souse each November as a matter of course, the community event of the killing giving way to 3 days of processing, and souse on the breakfast table as quiet proof that nothing had been lost, nothing thrown away, nothing wasted. Canned salmon was not the first choice and everybody knew it. It came in a flat pink tin from the grocery store shelf, cheaper than fresh fish by a mile, and on weekday mornings when the refrigerator held nothing that could become breakfast by itself, you drained it, picked out the skin and bones. The old women left the bones in and mashed them through because they were soft enough to eat and nothing was wasted. Mashed it with cracker crumbs or leftover cornbread, bound it with egg, shaped it into patties, and fried it in bacon grease until both sides browned. What came out was crisp-edged, dense, and savory in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the flat pink contents of the can it started as. Canned pink salmon became a federal commodity staple distributed through federal food assistance programs in the 1960s, which is how it ended up in so many low-income kitchens across the South and Midwest. They made something out of it that the people who designed those programs never imagined. They usually do. Leftover rice for breakfast was a Midwestern and Southern workaround so common it barely registered as a workaround. It was just what happened to the rice from Tuesday's supper if there was any left, which there usually was. You warmed it in a saucepan with whole milk, a spoon of sugar, and a shake of cinnamon, stirring slowly until the milk absorbed and the whole thing turned thick and custardy, fragrant with the spice in a way that felt deliberately made rather than improvised. Children ate it in the same bowl they'd use for cereal, without ever questioning whether it was a real breakfast or just a solution. Their mothers knew the difference and didn't mention it. The rice carton has been in the pantry for 60 years. The Tuesday supper it came from has been gone just as long. And the woman who knew when to stop adding milk, who watched the texture and not the clock, she has been gone the longest of all. But some breakfasts go back far enough that even the 1960s were late in their story. Johnny cakes, coarse cornmeal mixed with boiling water, a pinch of salt, no egg and no milk, cooked on a dry cast-iron griddle or directly on a flat stone, were the breakfast of New England settlers, enslaved people, and sharecroppers long before the colonies had a capital. The preparation was stripped to almost nothing. You poured until the batter held its shape, spread it thin, and cooked it until the bottom crisped and the top dried enough to flip. The outside crackled under a fork, and the inside stayed dense, almost gritty, tasting purely of toasted corn with nothing added to soften it. Rhode Island has maintained a specific Johnny Cake tradition using flint corn since the 17th century, with the Kenyon Cornmeal Company still milling the same white flint variety. In the 1960s, Johnny Cakes survived in the households of people old enough to remember when there was no other choice. Today, almost nobody makes them, which means almost nobody knows what corn tasted like before it was sweetened into something else. The soldiers called it something worse than SOS, and the name stuck because it was accurate. Creamed dried beef on toast, thin strips of salt-cured beef folded into a thick flour and milk cream sauce poured over white toast, came home from military kitchens in the pockets of returning veterans after World War II and Korea, and it sat down at the civilian breakfast table without apology. It was salty, filling, cheap enough to make any morning it appeared, and the men who'd eaten it in mess halls for years made it without any recipe because they didn't need one. You'd brown the flour in butter, added cold milk in stages, laid in the dried beef, and let the whole thing thicken while the toast went under the broiler. The Army's earliest documented recipes for it appear in military cookbooks from the early 1900s. By the 1960s, it had crossed fully from barracks to kitchen table, and children in veterans' households ate it on Saturday mornings without knowing where it came from, or understanding yet why their fathers ate it without saying much. Bonnie Clabber was raw milk left to sour on its own, set out in a cool room in a ceramic crock until it thickened naturally into something between yogurt and soft cheese, tangy and rich, without the intervention of any starter or culture because the raw milk carried everything it needed. You ate it with honey drizzled over the top or with molasses or plain with a spoon, and it was filling in the quiet way that cultured dairy is filling. Not heavy, just present. The word clabber comes from the Irish clabba, meaning thick, and the practice of eating naturally soured milk traveled to Appalachia, with the Scotch-Irish settlers who constituted 75% of the southern mountain population in the first U.S. Census of 1790. It remained in use through the 1960s in households that still kept a dairy cow because clabber required raw milk. Pasteurized milk doesn't sour the same way, it rots. When the last family cow left, clabber left with her. You cannot buy it. You cannot replicate it with store milk. It died the day refrigeration arrived, and nobody mourned it by name. When there was no syrup and no sugar to speak of, you made your own. A small pot of water, a handful of brown sugar or raw cane sugar, brought to a boil and reduced until it thickened just enough to pour. That was the syrup that went over the oatmeal on the mornings when the maple syrup tin was empty and there was nothing else sweet in the house. It tasted of caramel at the edge and faintly of molasses in the center, warmer and more complex than the packaged syrup it was replacing, though no one who made it thought of it that way. They thought of it as making do. In households across the rural South and Midwest in the 1960s, this kind of improvised sweetener appeared whenever the commercial option ran out, which was often, and the children who grew up eating it couldn't always tell you later whether what they remembered was the taste of the syrup or the taste of watching someone make something from almost nothing. Apple stack cake was a wedding cake before it was a breakfast, and it showed up at the breakfast table only because it was too good to save for company. The thin, gingerbread-like layers were baked separately, 6, 8, sometimes 10, and stacked with dried apple filling between each one, the spiced fruit softening the layers overnight into something unified, dense, and quietly extraordinary. You sliced it thin on Sunday morning, a half-inch at most, and ate it with coffee. Each layer had absorbed the fruit and the juice and each other until the whole thing tasted of Appalachian autumn in a way no single ingredient could account for. The tradition is documented as specific to the southern Appalachian Mountains, where in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, neighbors each contributed a layer to the bride's cake, the height of the cake reflecting how beloved the family was in the community. By the 1960s, the communal tradition had mostly become a family one, but the cake remained, and the breakfast slice of it remained, the quiet Sunday reward that nobody needed permission for. The last breakfast on this list cost almost nothing and meant everything, and it was the one children remembered longest. You split a scratch biscuit, the kind made with lard and buttermilk and baked in a cast iron pan until the top browned and the sides stayed soft, and you flooded the inside with cane syrup or sorghum poured directly from the tin, the syrup running into every torn edge and pooling in the hollow of the bottom half. You ate it before it soaked through. In the rural South and the Appalachian Mountains through the 1960s, cane syrup and sorghum were still the primary sweeteners in households that hadn't yet switched entirely to refined sugar. The molasses' dark depth of them tasting like the soil they came from. Children who ate this for breakfast didn't think of it as a poor man's meal. They thought of it as Saturday. The biscuit is a recipe anyone can follow. The syrup is still on the shelf, but the kitchen where it tasted like that, the hands, the iron pan, the particular morning light, that has been gone for a long time now, and no amount of cane syrup is going to bring it back. Enough of all this savory stuff. Let's go towards something that's actually sweet. Believe it or not, people had incredible tricks and tips for that. One of those was a rice and molasses bowl, which is the kind of dish that just inspires gentle waves of nostalgia in you. It's something that's drizzled with thick, dark molasses. The molasses, which makes for a very bittersweet, smoky bite with sweet undertones, tends to seep into the grains. This actually gives them such a nice autumn-coated color that really just makes you want to set up your best sheet in a park, call a few friends, and enjoy the small things in life. Historically, though, this was nothing that was so romantic. It was a poor man's breakfast and dessert, especially in most parts of the South and the Appalachian regions. It was very common to see among working-class Northeasterns in the 18th century, and it was something that was relied on to stretch ingredients when things were running low. This is because molasses was always really cheap and bought in bulk, and if people weren't growing their rice, they were stocking up on as much as they could. Rice, molasses, and different kinds of bowls are now bygones of different times, but they were really good. Since I can't stop thinking about sweets, let's circle back to them for a bit. Applesauce bread. Applesauce bread was one of those sweet, comforting recipes that made a comeback in the Great Depression when butter, sugar, and milk were hard to come by. Applesauce was cheap, easy to make, and could substitute for many of the pricier ingredients in baking. Applesauce added moisture and sweetness to bread without needing lots of sugar, butter, or oil. Pretty much all the good stuff that people didn't have access to. You'd mix it with flour, baking soda, and whatever spices were around. Cinnamon was the best, but you had to be lucky. This was the perfect recipe to create a dense, cake-like bread that was perfect for breakfast or dessert. And let's not forget the applesauce itself. It was a hero in its own right. People made it from leftover or bruised apples that would have otherwise gone to waste. So, not only was applesauce bread thrifty, but it was also the original waste-free, eco-friendly breakfast. Plus, it could be easily customized with nuts, raisins, or anything else you had on hand to make it stretch further. In a time when dessert was a rare treat, applesauce bread brought a little sweetness into some pretty tough days. Sometimes things just get old, and sometimes they just don't work. We've had our fair share of both, and scones with clotted cream and jam are a bit of a mix of the two. Now, US and UK cuisines don't generally tend to mix, even though we've had lots of crossovers in the past now. Scones with cream and jam, at least these ones that would use clotted cream, were the quintessential British snack. If your idea of John 32 from West Virginia is somebody in plaid or flannel getting real intimate with a hot dog, then your idea of Martin, 28 from Birmingham, is somebody in a blazer enjoying a scone. It's just what we associate with the people, you know? These scones were something that immigrants from the UK brought on over with them, and don't get me wrong, in their parts of the country where there would be large British-American presences, it definitely was something that got a lot of mileage. In other places, it just wasn't really that much of a hit, and clotted cream wasn't really something a lot of people had access to. Kind of a bummer when your core ingredient ends up being in short supply for the masses, but maybe this one staying a niche secret is a good thing. I'm not the biggest scone fan, after all, but this is all about you, so how do you feel about this little treat? I have quite a sweet tooth today, and I wish I could say that's because that time of the month is approaching. But, oh well, no excuses for me. Coming in on number 3, we have peanut butter muffins. This probably sounds familiar, And that is because you've most likely heard every health-oriented TikToker or Instagram influencer mention it at least once. It is quite popular in today's day and age, and not for bad reasons. But during the Great Depression, they weren't as luxurious as they are today. Quite the contrary, they were literal lifesavers. Peanut butter was cheap, packed with protein, and easy to store, making it a go-to ingredient for stretching meals. The muffins were a genius creation, made from simple pantry staples like flour, sugar, and a big scoop of peanut butter. They didn't need eggs or butter, which were often hard to come by, and they baked up into a hearty, slightly crumbly treat that filled you up for hours. The peanut butter provided a rich, nutty flavor, and you could eat them for breakfast, lunch, or as a snack, midday or midnight. They weren't just about the taste. They were supposed to give you strength for the day, and that's exactly what they did. They were a practical, budget-friendly way to get in as much protein as possible when times were tough. And come on, who doesn't love peanut butter in any way, shape, or form? Unfortunately, across this list, you'll find all sorts of final nails in various coffins. For Malasadas, it was just competition and bad PR. This Portuguese banger involves fried donuts that are really rich and decadent, but also really heavy and a little hard to make. You can kind of see where I'm going with this already, can't you? The thing is, Americans are pretty much creatures of habit. If you try to break away from that habit, you better be offering up gold on a plate. But if your plate consists of fried donuts with more of a regional appeal in states like Hawaii, then you might not make the cut. Another thing about Hawaii is its thriving Portuguese community, so a dish like this was always right at home there. But what about everywhere else? People thought it took a lot of work to make this dish, which would also leave you feeling pretty sluggish and bloated. Plus, the short shelf life really didn't help matters. People are used to their donuts lasting a long while, but with malasadas, the texture and flavor would go up in smoke pretty quick if you just let them catch dust on a table, and eating all that in one go was never really ideal, especially if we're talking about a workday. Mix that in with the whole wave of healthy eating, and you can understand where the bad PR side of things comes from here. Beef kidney stew is a rich, earthy dish that has a lot to bring to the table. Bold, distinctly old-fashioned flavors, and more protein than your muscles probably know what to do with. It gives a really deep umami base. It has a little bit of a mineral flavor, slightly metallic. You know, that's par for the course when you're dealing with actual meat. But you throw this into a skillet with some slow-cooked onions, garlic, red wine, and bay leaves, and you'll end up with this incredibly exotic-looking stew. Dark, glossy, and full of flavor, it's something that has a velvety texture also, thanks to being thickened by flour. The chunks of soft, tender carrot and potato in there also give it an incredible contrast that the dish really needs. Now, historically, this has always been a staple of the working class, especially when you go into the 19th and 20th centuries. Today, beef kidney stew is something that's not really relevant outside of the usual TikTok bringing back age-old recipes. As I mentioned before, eggs were hard to come by in those times, and it showed. Food didn't contain enough protein, and it was hard to maintain energy levels throughout the day. Now, I know eggless waffles might sound like an oxymoron, but during the Great Depression, you had to get creative. The secret? People started using a mix of flour, baking powder, and any liquid that was available, milk if you were living on a higher leg, and water if you were not. This created a batter that cooked up into crispy waffles. The texture wasn't quite as fluffy as regular waffles, but they were still delicious and could be topped with syrup, butter, or even some homemade jam if you had it. Eggless waffles became a symbol of resourcefulness and showed that you didn't need fancy ingredients to make something tasty. These waffles were the perfect balance of crunchy and chewy, proving that breakfast could still feel special, even when the cupboards were practically bare. One part of American culture that really never should have died off or leaned towards simplicity was fancy little holiday season variations like Christmas tree waffles. What were these? They were just your typical everyday waffles, same maple syrup, same time in the oven, same everything. But they had so much love poured into them. The idea here was to make it look like a Christmas tree, and people pulled out all the stops, the whole 9 yards, to make theirs resemble one as closely as possible. It even became like a community competition. That type of thing was so common to see in America during the 20th century, and it really added some personalization to the holiday season, which is sorely missing today. It was a way to have genuine fun with what you were eating and involved even kids in the cooking process. They'd love playing around with the frostings, sprinkles, and fruits so that they could have the most faithful Christmas tree pancakes on the block. Adults would similarly pour some real brain power into getting theirs to pop off. It was just a much more fun way to enjoy a classic we have every day in honor of Christmas, but nowadays, takeout culture and pre-made desserts from bakeries have replaced trends like that. People would rather make a charcuterie board over any decorative dessert today. Salted herring with potatoes is a dish that is built entirely on contrast. The briny meets the bland, and strong undertones meet soft aftertastes. The herring itself is something that's preserved in brine, right? So it's deeply flavored. It's firm when it comes to the flesh, it's slightly oily, and that tang isn't for everyone. But an honest-to-God seafood lover is going to enjoy the life out of it. The dish itself is something that's most commonly served cold, slightly warmed, or just with a side of elegant mashed potatoes. As elegant as they can be when they're made by a frustrated mom who just wants to get the table set up, really. A bit of chopped onion, sour cream, and dill, and you'll be remembering your mom's cooking soon enough. You know, salted herring with potatoes has always been something that's deeply considered a working-class regular, especially in the American Midwest and Northeast. It was so common to see this in coastal communities where fresh fish were always abundant. Preservation was something even kids could tell you about. Salted herring let families eat protein year-round, and potatoes were cheap and easy to grow, and they could be made into 1,000 different things. Moving on to something less fun, egg and potato hash. Egg and potato hash was the ultimate Depression-era breakfast because it was cheap, filling, and easy to throw together. Potatoes, one of the most budget-friendly foods around, were diced and fried until crispy, then mixed with scrambled eggs. If you were lucky, you might throw in a little onion or whatever leftovers were kicking around. Bits of ham, maybe even a stray vegetable. The beauty of this dish was that you could stretch it as far as you needed. Not enough eggs? No problem, just add more potatoes. The fried potatoes added that crispy texture, while the eggs brought in some much-needed protein to keep you going through the day. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was warm and hearty, plus it kept everyone fed and happy. Egg and potato hash was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and could easily turn a couple of basic items into a satisfying breakfast that made you feel like you weren't missing out, even during tough times. As nice as it is, that was a trait that was absent from a lot of the food that you'd commonly associate with the 20th century. Take Johnny cakes, right? Pretty typical boomer dish that's been around for the better part of a century and has made more than a few hundred appearances at tables all over the nation. Yet, it's not here anymore, not at all. And the reason? It went away from mainstream diets because it was seen as old-fashioned. The trend and focus on cornmeal and corn in general dying out as people moved towards more vegetables like greens and sweet potatoes, and a lot more of a focus for wear-oriented baking, which is a step away from how cornmeal was used as a primary ingredient. The pancakes and breads of today are almost exclusively made with wheat. Then there's the whole public perception angle. This dish just isn't seen as luxurious or even endearingly rustic. It's most commonly associated with poor man's food, and that doesn't leave a good impression on people anymore, even though that couldn't be further from the truth. This thing had a lot of regional influence, and it served the people well, but the times haven't been kind to the recipe. Cold potato with an onion salad was basically the chic way to go vegetarian back then. The dish had a subtle charm that heavily relied on the texture and seasoning. It was also ideally served chilled, because, well, science. I'm just kidding, but basically, the starch starts to firm up. This gives the potato a much more dense and sometimes waxy bite that contrasts really well with the creamy dressings. It also works spectacularly with the flavors present in an onion salad, which honestly adds the perfect crunchy element. Cold potatoes can feel like a mush fest after a few bites, so having some alternative textures in there really helps smoothen everything along. Historically, cold potato and onion salad is something we likely derived from 18th century Europe. This is a pretty traditional recipe in German and French circles, and leftover boiled potatoes were always dressed in oil, vinegar, and herbs so that waste could be avoided. American potato salads are something that evolved from these traditions, and they gained a lot of popularity by the time of the 20th century as a potluck, picnic, and community dinner staple. One of the most popular breakfasts of the time was Depression donuts. Forget your regular Krispy Kreme order and start writing this down. Depression donuts were all about survival since people back then weren't really rolling in dough, pun intended. But with minimal ingredients like flour, water, baking powder, and maybe a spoonful of sugar, these donuts became like a gift sent from above. Since eggs, butter, and milk were often scarce or expensive, people improvised with what they had. For the preparation, you'd mix up the dough and make it into little rings or balls depending on your preference, and fry in oil until golden brown. The results were immaculate. But if you've never fired donuts, don't expect this to be easy peasy, lemon squeezy. You have to be careful because that oil will fool you. You think you're the one in charge, setting the stove temperatures and being all fancy. But once that oil is hot, there's no telling if you are frying or burning those donuts. So be careful, because donuts are no joke. These size extra large pancakes, on the other hand, have all the star power you could want in something that migrates its way from German tables to American couches. Dutch baby pancakes are exactly how you make a first impression on a foreign audience. Appeal to the familiar, bring in the new, and find a balance between both. Flavors that Americans typically hadn't ever associated with pancakes were suddenly on the cards for them, and that went for textures too, because this really didn't feel like any pancake your mom would whip up or one available in a diner. These needed a preheated oven and had to be baked for a lot longer. One pancake per person isn't the rule here. This is very much a group meal. Unfortunately, you have to have a lot of confidence in your recipe if your aim is to shake up America's love for its convenient pancake-oriented breakfasts. These pancakes weren't as customizable because they couldn't be mixed directly into the batter, and they took a lot more time to make than regular ones did. Americans think of pancakes as a quick, perfect breakfast before work, and that's the situation they often find themselves craving one in. This did not fit that memo, and for a few more reasons, like competition from other, more convenient and trendier options of the era, Dutch baby pancakes fell off. Ham and red-eye gravy is something that's considered a Southern classic. It has a really bold, salty personality, and it's a very no-nonsense flavor profile as well. This is a dish that takes country ham, which is typically dry-cured and goes the pan-frying route. The idea is to fry it until you see those dark brown edges crisping up in the pan. After that, you get an incredible flavor explosion in the form of concentrated pork drippings, and these then take a further unexpected turn. You start to pour in strong black coffee. Now I know you're about to fast forward 10 seconds, but hear me out, okay? The result isn't creamy or thick like you would expect. The coffee ends up deglazing the pan, and it creates this super thin reddish-brown gravy that has an unmistakable sheen to it. The result is a punchy, smoky, and bitter-tasting gravy, but not overwhelmingly bitter, and the coffee cuts through a lot of the richness of the ham fat. This is something you would see so commonly among rail workers in Tennessee and Alabama, especially if it was in the afternoon hours. The caffeine really helped with the job. Staying on the sweet side of things, we'll be talking about the ultimate zero-waste recipe, banana bread. Back then, letting food go to waste was practically a crime against humanity, and banana bread was the best solution for those overripe bananas to be saved. Instead of tossing them, creative cooks found a delicious way to use them up. They mixed them with flour, sugar, and a bit of baking soda, and created a nice, dense loaf of heaven. Eggs and butter were optional, and people often replaced them with whatever fat they had lying around. The natural sweetness of bananas made it a budget-friendly alternative to other desserts. Plus, banana bread was highly versatile. You could throw in nuts, raisins, cinnamon, or whatever odds and ends you could scrape up to stretch it even further. Banana bread was one of those Depression-era foods that stuck around to this day, and it's for good reasons. It is the epitome of a sweet, delicious, but healthy treat that has got everyone in a chokehold. It is healthy and packed with nutrients, while still remaining tasteful and filling. No wonder all those cooking influencers are making banana bread every other day. Gee, show us another recipe. Here's another evident case of something losing to its betters. Caramel rolls. Much like how Dutch baby pancakes lost in the long run to the standard, nostalgic, and ever so timeless regular pancake, caramel rolls could never overtake cinnamon rolls. They were pretty good for what they were, and they even made a pretty decent name for themselves in cafes and bakeries. Caramel rolls had it all initially. They were really nice. They had sweetness, nice packaging, good marketing, all the things you'd need to really get yourself out there in the wider world. Unfortunately, there were a few reasons they just fell a little short of cementing themselves as a staple of American eating and baking that would last well into the 2000s. They were also messy and hard to make, and while the sweetness was a plus point, it also made them really calorically dense and bad for you in the larger picture of things. See, by this point in time, the American masses were glucose veterans. They went through ice cream parlors, soda fountains, the golden age of fast food chains, and so many other things that really racked up the damage they were doing to their bodies just through their diets. As a result, as time kept going on, people started to abandon things like this which were just excessive. Plus, good old cinnamon rolls do the job so much better, and they're not really that bad for you as long as you keep it under control. Mutton fat bread is something that's unapologetically itself. It's too rich, too deep, and it has all the meaty flavors you could ask for. The essence of rendered sheep fat is unmistakable here. It's something that goes perfectly well with day-old bread, slightly dry, a bit hard, and coarse. You know, the entire 9 yards. This is as rustic of a dish as it gets. It absorbs the hot fat in this dish and it crisps on the outside while getting extremely soft on the inside. This dish is something that you would see really commonly whenever you would pass by factory towns or farms, especially among rural laborers, such as people in the 19th and 20th centuries. They were sheep farming regions like the Appalachia, Wales, or the Highlands, and mutton fat was an extremely common ingredient in these areas. That's because it was always far more cheaper than butter, or just a lot more flavorful than lard. The ideal material for frying. The fried bread was also a good way for people to stretch meals, and although some people didn't vibe with the overly gamey taste, back then it was considered a standard of most red meat-based meals. I wish these were the sweet kind of muffins, but unfortunately they're not. We are going to get to know one of the breakfast staples of the Great Depression era, carrot muffins. Some might say that this was a sweet way to sneak some veggies to the table. With butter and sugar in short supply, people used the natural sweetness of carrots to help flavor their muffins, creating a sweet and moist breakfast without breaking the bank. Now, I get that carrots have a sweet taste to them, but I wouldn't call this meal sweet unless someone added some sugar to it. Not much, just a little would be enough. These muffins were also super versatile. If you had some cinnamon or nutmeg, you could spice them up. Or if you had some raisins or nuts, you could throw them in too for some extra flavor. They were an affordable, filling option that got people through hard times and got some vegetables into kids' mouths and bellies. Not a total parenting waste, don't you think? Just kidding, it was an epic parenting victory. Any veggies that somehow get into kids' hands is a win-win situation. So eggs in a hole, on the other hand, were a classic that was seen exactly as a dish for at least middle-class homes and people who knew their way around a kitchen. A bit of presentation and flair, and it's a wonder what people will start seeing you as. I guess glow-ups and appearances matter even for food, don't they? Looks-wise, this was an appetizing little dish thanks to the egg cooked inside the cutout piece of bread. It gave it a real air of, yeah, this is fancy to it, which was nice at the time. Although something like this would still be seen as just okay now. Despite the cover, this book's actually pretty simple, which was also its downfall. Sometimes you need a bit of complexity to give you an edge over the competition, and sometimes sticking to the simple roots, the tried and tested methods and flavors, is exactly what a dish needs to remain top dog. Both sides of the spectrum have cases of recipes that took the memo a little too strongly to heart and ended up paying for it. Eggs in a hole were considered too simple as tastes leaned more and more towards what we have now, in modern America. And it fell out of favor with the people when trendier and more visually appealing breakfasts started popping out. Things like smoothie bowls, rice bowls, avocado toast, and the like. Rolled oats and bacon are a really humble and delicious combination. It does two things very perfectly. It balances the comfort of a cream-heavy dish with the allure of smoky flavors. Now, that's not very hard to do, but I think when a dish makes that work, it's always one for the Notes app. The oats are something you simmer slowly in water and milk. You know, the usual preparation. You have to wait until it becomes completely porridge, though. Stir in these crisp crumbles of bacon, and suddenly the dish transforms into a wonderful savory fantasy. You get to have this decadent texture with just the tiniest bits of smoky aftertaste, and it makes for a dish that just feels like the perfect autumn or winter breakfast. Historically, though, this is a dish that you would actually find more often in the summer times, when people were really trying to stretch out their meals and scraping for protein. Especially in the early 20th century, when rationing meant that almost everyone had to think conservatively about what they were eating and how much of it they were using. The savory oats bowl couldn't ever go mainstream, but I think that suits the quiet nature of the dish. Coffee soup, the liquid breakfast of the hard times. Coffee soup was one of the more unconventional Depression-era breakfasts, but it made sense when you think about the times. Coffee was cheap, which might come as a shocker since it is so expensive now. It was also widely available, so when families didn't have much to eat, they turned it into a meal. The recipe was dead simple. Pour a cup of strong, hot coffee over a slice of day-old bread or crackers, and there you have it, breakfast. Sometimes sugar or milk would be added if they were available, but more often than not, it was just coffee and bread. This was a quick and easy way to stretch a little coffee into something that felt a lot more filling than it looked. Coffee soup wasn't exactly gourmet, but it gave people the energy boost they needed to start their day, and it was a comforting routine when other breakfast options were out of reach. The bitter taste of coffee combined with the soft bread created a unique flavor that grew on you after a while. I am a coffee addict as much as the next person, maybe even more, but this may be the tipping point for me. But I guess it's kind of like a tiramisu, only without the cream filling, right? Maybe I would try it. God only knows it can never be too much coffee. You know, for something called the Does Not Disappoint Breakfast Casserole, this couldn't live up to its name. It was made out of eggs, sausage, cheese, hash browns, and even bread. And yes, for those of you who are calorically observant, that is a dump truck of carbs. It also takes a lot of time to make. It can take an hour or more to get going. And if you get greedy and pop it out early, you just won't have a good-tasting breakfast. Also, this might seem odd to you, but Planned Parenthood is another thing. See, the trend these days is smaller and smaller families or married couples even putting off kids in favor of building a career together and getting their credit up. Back in the 20th century, it was the complete opposite. People had families of 4, 5, and even 6, and that goes for people living in uptown cities too. That was the norm, you know? Get married, have kids. As a result, most of the food you'll see from that era is extremely crowd-oriented. It's meant to feed several people, and that's why it takes a long while to make too. And that just doesn't fit the breakfast needs of the modern American, who's pretty much used to grabbing deli wraps on the way to their 9-hour shift. Souse is a dish that actually shows you just how much resourcefulness the working class had back then. The nose-to-tail mentality of people was really something that persisted throughout several centuries before coming to a close leading up to the 2000s. This is a dish that was incredibly averse to being typical. It was one of those things that was different not because it wanted to be, or because it was trying to be, but because it just really had to be. The cooked meat was something that was chopped, mixed with different kinds of vinegar and spices, and suspended in a natural gelatin as it cooled down. Served cold, thick, and in delicate little slices, it had a punch that really helped to balance out the flavors of the pork, with a texture that will keep you stimulated throughout the whole meal. This is a dish that shows you all the different flavors the American South really has to offer. Fried oatmeal patties might not sound so glamorous, but when you were trying to make the most out of the little you had, they were a treat. This Depression-era breakfast was a clever way to use up leftover oatmeal, which was already a cheap and filling staple. Instead of just reheating plain old porridge, people would mix the cold oatmeal with a little flour or cornmeal, form it into patties, and fry it up in a pan. I don't know how I didn't think of this. It's genius. The amount of leftover oatmeal I could have saved. Please don't call the Eco Patrol on me. I never know how much is too much. The result of this creative endeavor was crispy on the outside and soft on the inside patties. They could be eaten plain or topped with a little butter or syrup if you had it. And like most of these dishes, they were versatile. They could be savory or sweet, depending on your cravings and your abilities at the given moment. Fried oatmeal patties were a simple but satisfying way to stretch leftovers into another meal. And let's be honest, anything fried tends to taste better. Do I need to reference again the Kentucky Fried Chicken? I don't think so. Fried oatmeal patties were a great way to turn mushy old oatmeal into something you'll look forward to eating. These kitchens went quiet and nobody marked the day. If any of this sounds like home, leave its name in the comments below.